Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Dave, you're the audience, and this is a Lunchbox Lesson offered to you by Schoharie Crossing State Historic Site. It's going to be a wonderful program. Thank you for tuning in. Today we have Nellie Ludemann, who is the Executive Director of the Seneca Falls Historical Society and has been with the Society for over 3 years, first as an educator and now as the Director. While in her educator role, she has had the opportunity to expand the Historical Society's educational programs for children and create new opportunities for students inside the museum. Her favorite thing about the museum is its rich collections, those that showcase the life of the family that lived inside the museum, but also the history of the surrounding area of Seneca Falls. Outside of the museum, Nellie enjoys the outdoors, dancing, hanging out at home with her cat, Tiberius. And please join me in welcoming Nellie Ludemann.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for joining today. So once again, my name is Nellie Ludemann. I am the Executive/Education Director for the Seneca Falls Historical Society. So just a few things before we really get started. I have a couple, if you notice down here, I'll have some audio coming through the PowerPoint. I've turned up the volume on my computer all the way. Some of the recordings can be a little bit loud. Some of them are really soft. So that's just your volume warning for now. I apologize if I hurt your ears. Another warning, I like to talk a lot. And I'm probably going to overwhelm you with a lot of information today. So if I'm not able to answer your question at the end of this, or you find that you think about this later tonight and you have another question, please email me. I've included our email on every single slide, apparently except for this one, but I'm more than happy to answer any questions that I'm able to at a later time. So let's get started. Sorry, my computer might be a little slow. There we go. All right, so just a little bit about us before I get really started. The Seneca Falls Historical Society was founded in 1896, chartered in 1904, and we really strive to collect, preserve, and educate the history of Seneca Falls. Our collections span out to mostly Seneca Falls, but we do kind of extend to the rest of Seneca County. We have guided tours daily, opportunities for research, and we do a lot of community programming, school programs. Down in the bottom, I guess, right-hand corner, our EEC program, that is our once-a-month educational resource bag for children in grades 3 to 5. That's kind of one of our newer programs. I think this is probably our 3rd year, so it's probably not that new, but anyway. We are currently housed in what we like to call the Becker House. That is, I'm currently in the dining room. It is a 23-room, 3-story Queen Anne Victorian dwelling. It was originally built by a man named Edward Minders in the 1850s. He was the son of early land developer Colonel Wilhelmus Minders. He was also part of the Baird Land Company, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. In the 1880s, the house was sold to a woman named Ellen Partridge, and she made a lot of changes and a lot of renovations to make the house what it looks like today. So that bottom left picture is pretty much what we look like. This was in 1949, and we don't really have the full wraparound porch or that decorative balcony, but for the most part, we still look like that. So finally, we have the Becker family, who the house is kind of named after. They were led by Norman and Catherine Becker, and they lived here from 1891 to 1961, and that is when their daughter Florence, she sold the house to the Historical Society in 1961. All right. So when speaking about the mill, to kind of truly understand its history, you got to go way back to the early 1800s. Back to a time when the rapids that made up the Cuga-Seneca Canal were being tamed by the Baird Land Company, and that was way back in 1818. So the Baird Land Company built locks on the canal to kind of tame it, to make boat transportation a lot easier. And the Baird Land Company's involvement with building up the canal really led to this kind of stranglehold monopoly over the 1,400 acres of water power that was on both sides of the canal that really kind of make up Seneca Falls. So this created a wonderful opportunity for the Baird Land Company to build up the industry in the area and really grow their company. Fortunately, that's not really what happened. They were unsuccessful. So they had a lot of landowners and companies coming to them wanting to buy and lease the land so that they could develop it. But the Baird Land Company thought that what would be built on the land would become competition for them. So that kind of led to financial difficulties inside the company and eventually led to them being forced to dissolve, divide, and sell the land by 1825. So it didn't really last too long. So seeing this opportunity, Judge Gary Sackett, he was the first judge here in Seneca Falls. Ansel Bascom, he was the first president or mayor of Seneca Falls, and Andrew Tillman, who was a manufacturer. They bought up the land, especially on the south side of the canal, and they started building and selling the plots of land. So what the Baird Land Company should have been doing, they did. So well development was starting to build up on that south side of the canal. 33 residents of Seneca Falls got together and they discussed this formation of a woolen goods manufacturing company. And those men, they ended up purchasing a bunch of shares and created what became the first trustees of the Seneca Woolen Manufacturing Company. And that company was incorporated in 1829. So construction for the Seneca Woolen Manufacturing Company began around 1829 and it finished in the spring of 1844. That first picture on the top right, that is actually from Judge Gary Sackett's ledger. So that's kind of the south side of the canal. It looks upside down, but we're looking at it kind of an aerial view. Anyway. So the south side of the canal was pretty ideal for what they wanted to do with this site because it offered the water power that they would need to build the whole manufacturing process. So Sackett, Tillman, and Bascom hired the Latham brothers, who were Franklin, Edward, William, Obadiah, and Nathaniel. They were local contractors, and they were hired to be the architects for the mill. So the final finished product was a 4.5-story limestone mill with a slate roof and a full-length clear-story monitor in the attic. And the limestone that was used to make the mill was actually locally sourced from a quarry that was a few miles away. So Sackett, who was kind of the leader on the project, his goal for this whole thing was he wanted to build a building where the 9 main steps of the manufacture of woven woolen goods, try saying that 5 times fast, could happen all in one place. He wanted to create a place where people could buy these finished woolen goods instead of making it themselves at home. So even though the woolen mill here in Seneca Falls was kind of away from the main hub of wool manufacturing, which was actually located in Washington County at the time, the proximity of the mill to the Albany-Rochester Railroad, as well as the Cayuga-Seneca Canal, really allowed for easier transportation of their raw materials, as well as their finished goods. So the mill became a depot where wool growers could bring their crops and then manufacturers could purchase these local wool at set prices. However, due to stock loss and mysterious financial difficulties, the company began to decline and eventually headed for collapse by 1854. So we're going to go through a lot of transition now. Jacob P. Chamberlain, who was a major stockholder in the company, he worked with Sackett to kind of dissolve and then reorganize the company, and they called it the Phoenix Mill Company. So that's a kind of a picture of mill later on, but also called the Phoenix Mill. So one of his many improvements, Chamberlain actually added a retail market inside of the mill so that local residents could buy wool at wholesale prices. So he kind of made it a little more accessible for the people of Seneca Falls. In 1864, Chamberlain sold the company to Abel Downs and Albert Jewett, both of which were beginning to kind of dabble in the wool manufacturing business. Abel Downs was previously in the pump business. That's what a lot of big named industry men did in Seneca Falls. They kind of had their hands in every single little pot. So he's in the pump business. Now he wants to get into the textile business. So there was also a 2.5-story brick addition added in the 1860s, which included the smokestack, which you can still see today. That happened in 1860s, sorry. Just a little fun fact. So during 1859, so kind of for the Civil War efforts, the United States Army contracted the knitting company to produce 85,000 pairs of socks and a bunch of blankets for the Army, which I thought was cool. So competition grew in the area and the company kind of began to flounder again. So Albert Jewett ended up selling off the company to Rhode Islander J.N. Burdick and James Aiken, who was from Troy, New York. It was renamed the Gleason Knitting and Manufacturing Company. Then, that didn't last too long because the company went into the hands of Harrison Chamberlain, who was a very successful Seneca Falls businessman. He was the manager of the National Yeast Company. He was the president of the Exchange National Bank. And he was also a co-founder and the first president of the Seneca Falls Historical Society. Just a little plug in there. So he renamed the mill to Chamberlain Son Woolen Mill. So by 1804, the mill was quite successful, bringing in 2,000 pounds of wool, which then created 1,200 yards of fabric daily, giving the mill a profit of $350,000. And that was a year. Annually. However, that was all a facade. That wasn't actually true. They were actually about $160,000 in debt. And a lot of the properties, like the outbuildings, the extra storage facilities, they all began to come under investigation. So there's a lot of shady things happening. So the mill eventually closed its doors in 1905 and wouldn't reopen for another 12 years. So with the creation of the barge canal system in 1915, it was a way to kind of improve and expand on the canal kind of already in place. And it brought a lot of new economic opportunities. On March 9th, 1917, newspapers started announcing that George Gebb and Thomas Garvin of Connecticut were now leasing the mill, which they eventually purchased in 1922. But both of them started updating and kind of reinventing the mill. So they added electricity in 1917, they added all new machinery, and they added running water. The mill soon became the second largest employment and production industry in Seneca Falls by 1934. And at the time, about 60% of the company was women. Fortunately, I don't know what 60% of what, but 60% of the company were women. By 1948, both Gebb and Garvin had passed away, and the company was left in the hands of their son-in-law, who was named Francis Sewin, better known as Bud, and Bud is going to come up a lot later. So Bud's wife, Clara Gebb Sewin, and his sister-in-law, Ida Mae Gebb, were actually the vice president and secretary/treasurer for the company. By 1965, the company sold $18 million in product annually. So that was $5 million in hosiery, $3 million in woven cloth, and $10 million in yarn. So later, the company would expand to include men's dress hose, children's socks, athletic socks, work hose, and women's sportswear. So he expanded what they offered. In January of 1959, which is actually that middle picture there, one of the company's outbuildings, which was located on Bridge Street, actually burned to the ground, and it cost the company about $2.5 million. Fortunately, all of the workers that were working in the building at the time were able to get out safely. But this is kind of where we start seeing the effect that this company had on the community. Following the fire, there was this outpour of support and encouraging messages from the community to the company. In December of that year, there was a celebration that included a lot of speakers from a lot of unions and businesses in the area, and they all wanted to extend their support. The mill kind of became this symbol of prosperity, industrial history, and was one of the most significant employers in the area. And because of that, everybody wanted to give back or contribute in some way. By the 1960s, Bud's son, George Sewin, starts to take over the company. And he also puts his mark on the company. So he builds a 25,000 square foot addition that was used as an extra warehouse and also used to help increase production. So at this time, the company employed 430 people. The company also started, instead of like the hosiery, the women's sportswear, the men's work stuff, they started focusing only on socks. That was really their only product. But they had orders from Eddie Bauer, Ralph Lauren, The Gap, Sears Roebuck, a bunch of other big name companies would order from the mill. Unfortunately, through the years, George incurred huge debts, and in an effort to pay some of them off, he ended up selling the company to Ridgeview Incorporated. This was a company out of North Carolina, and he sold it for $12 million, and this was in 1995. So that was kind of, unfortunately, the beginning of the end for the company. The Ridgeview was not favored by the people of Seneca Falls, or even the people working in the mill. They really felt that this out-of-state management didn't understand what was happening in the mill. They weren't there enough to really understand the culture inside the mill. So Ridgeview ended up closing the mill in 1999, claiming that they had failing stock, which to some people, that's not really the case, but that is the official story. When the mill finally closed their doors, they were actually the last standing textile mill in New York. So that's a little disappointing, but. So since the closing of the mill, the people of Seneca Falls have once again rallied around the mill. They created the Seneca Knit Development Corporation, which was an organization which purchased the land and building to save it from demolition. In January of 2007, the building and land were passed in ownership to the National Women's Hall of Fame. Since then, the building has come a long way from when it closed in 1999 to now. Much of that credit goes to the Seneca Knit Development Corporation, but a lot of it goes to the National Women's Hall of Fame. They have been really working to revitalize and rehabilitate the building to create a space to showcase not only the mill's history, but all of the amazing women that have become pioneers in their field from all over the country. So their newest project was kickstarted in October of 2022, where they broke ground to create more exhibit space on the second floor, as well as rehabilitating the spiral staircase inside, adding a main staircase, and building a new elevator shaft. So the company leading that charge is LaChase Construction Services, LLC. And that is actually being led by an all-woman project team, which is cool. So I was fortunate enough to be at the Kickstart, so in 2022, so that's my bottom picture there. It was really cool, and I'm really excited to see where that goes. But anyway, we're gonna move on. So when David asked me to speak with you about a topic that kind of related to both women's rights and the canal, this is the first thing that I thought of, because I've always been told that the Seneca Knitting Mill was known for hiring women, especially during war times, and for being a place that would hire women when nobody else would. So with that thought in mind, my coworker and I came up with the idea to conduct oral history interviews. We were hoping that this would kind of help me discover whether what we heard about the mill was actually true or not. So that began my journey of learning more about the culture inside the mill, kind of what the magazines and newspapers wouldn't tell you, what the people inside the mill would tell you. So these are some of the questions that we asked. We also took the information given from these interviews. It's also for our archives, so for future research. So that's why some of them don't exactly relate to directly to kind of women inside the mill. It's generic. So when we put out the call to social media and on email blasts that we were looking for individuals who had worked in the mill or had family members that worked in the mill, we only ended up getting about 6 interviews. However, every single one of our 6 people had either 1 or 2 or some of them 3 family members that also worked in the mill. So we got a lot of those stories as well. So we really had like 15 participants. So all of our interview participants did consent to the interview and for their name and results of their interview to be included in this presentation. However, we did have some people that asked that their name not be included. So for this presentation, we are going to refer to them as male participant and female participant. So it's one of each. So these are our participants. As you can see, most of them have worked at the mill for over 20 years. Some of them a little bit less, but majority. So the mill was really someplace where you could start working when you were a teenager, and then you could retire from there as well. You never really wanted to leave. Some of the participants that were there when the mill closed, they said if the mill was still around, they would still be working there. So that really gives you kind of a major clue into what the work environment was like inside of the mill. So as we go through the interviews, the information provided from these participants are really going to relate to when Bud and George Sewin were in charge, and then Ridgeview. So our time frame of reference is going to be the 1920s to about 1999. So much like Judge Gary Sackett's original idea of bringing all the steps of the wool process into one building, the modern mill kind of created a production line of departments that would take the yarn and transform it into the finished product. So for the most part, each of our interviewees could tell us that there were approximately 15 departments that made up this entire process of the mill. So yarn would start in the blending room, then it would travel to the card room, then to the winding and twisting room, and then on to the steamer room. It would travel then upstairs to the knitting room and seamstresses room, sorry. Then it would travel back downstairs to the turning, washing, and drying rooms, where eventually the finished product would have to pass through the inspection room, then go on to packing and shipping. So it was kind of an up and down process. It wasn't very linear at all. Other departments include salesmen, payroll, maintenance, and orders. So my chart here shows you each of the departments. And then on the other side, it shows you where women could work and where women weren't allowed to work. So we're going to kind of go through the process again. So the blending and card room, really only men worked there. And actually, we were told that women were not allowed in the card room. There were big machines, these auto board machines, that women could get hurt if they were inside that room. They could kind of look in. A couple of our interviewees actually kind of poked their head in, but they weren't allowed inside the room, which ironically, the scariest accident that happened at this place involved a man in that room. So anyway, the winding, twisting, steamers, and knitting rooms could be a combination of both men and women. The seamstresses were only women. And a lot of our interviewers actually said, you did not mess with the seamstresses. They were older Italian ladies and they were there to work, get the job done. You did not mess with them. So the turning was kind of a combination of men and women. Washing was mostly men, and that was mostly because they had to pick up these big bags of socks, like wet wool socks. So you needed a lot of strength. So I think women could be in washing, but they really weren't. Drying was a combination. Inspectors were pretty much women, only women. Packers and shippers could be either. The salesmen were pretty much only men. And it wasn't until later into the late 80s and 90s where women could be into the salesman department, but it was pretty much only men. Payroll was women. Maintenance was also only men. Women couldn't drive any of the forklifts. They weren't allowed to touch them. Women were also not allowed on the third floor. Don't really know why. I was told that's where the product was. So apparently they couldn't look at the product once they were done making it. I don't know. But they also weren't allowed in the basement. Again, not really sure why. There was a break room down there, but they weren't allowed to use it. But according to our interviews, the only two departments that women had or could be able to be in top supervisory roles were the seamstresses and the inspectors. So any office work that happened was usually done by women. Secretarial work, like payroll, the secretaries for Bud and George were women. Any maintenance work were done by men. So our male participant, he told us that for 1 week in July every year, the mill would actually shut down. And it would kind of be like a reset week. That's when they would fix any broken machines. They would paint any walls, general repair for the building, basically. And that actually lined up with Gould's Pumps, which is another big company here. So a lot of husbands would work at Gould's while their wives worked at the mill. So having this week off, that's when everybody could kind of take their vacation. But our male participant, he was in maintenance. He was a fixer. So he was not allowed to take the week off. He had to work. And 1 year, there was a group of women who came up to him and they asked if they could work that week as well. And apparently George, who was the boss at the time, George Suen, he was immediately against it. He said women were not allowed to paint. And apparently our male participant, it took him quite a bit of convincing to George telling him that, you know, women are just as capable as painting as men, to really let George or have George let the women paint that week. All right. So these are some of pictures of some of the departments inside the mill. Number one is, and of course I lost my cheat sheet, but number one I believe is the knitting room. Number two is the yarn room. Number three, I believe she's turning. So when the socks are made, they're inside out, and then you have to turn them back around. Number four is the knitting room again. Number five is the washroom. So the washers were these big machines, and that's kind of why you need a lot of strength, because you do a lot of socks at one time. Number six is the drying room. So you would have to put the socks on these like molds, and they're metal, so they heat up, and then it would dry the sock. Number seven is an inspection room. And the women working in there, they were paid by piecework, which means that they were paid by how many socks they inspected. After they inspected it, they would fill out a little card, and that would go in an envelope. And then at the end of the day, they would get paid based on how many socks that they got through. Number eight is a woman in the bobbin room. She's grabbing yarn to then go into the knitting room. Number nine is the packing and shipping room. So you can see there's some gentlemen in there. 10 is the knitting room again. So all women. My side picture, that again is the mold that was used to dry the socks, the metal one on the left. And then the right is kind of a mold reference for creating the socks. So newspapers going back to the 1880s detail the mill hiring men, women, and children. So they were hiring women way back in the 1880s. So none of the articles actually break down how many of each gender they would hire. So advertisements from around World War II is when we start seeing this explicit recruitment of women for the mill. So all of these pictures here are advertisements from newspapers in the 1940s. So one of our interviewees, her name was Ellen. She said that the mill provided a source of income for women when other jobs wouldn't take women. Ellen's mother and her aunt started working for the mill in the late 1920s, and they were actually both teens at the time. In fact, Ellen's mother, she actually dropped out of school at the age of 15 so that she could go work at the mill to be able to provide this extra income for her family. So we're gonna try out this audio.
My sense is for all of these ladies, it was never, certainly the income. The mill provided an income for women at a time when a lot of jobs would not have been open to women.
Yeah, especially in the 20s.
Yeah. And so it fulfilled a need for a lot of families that needed that extra money. But my sense, my mother, my aunt, any of them that I ever talked to, there was a dedication to the company. It became a part of them. There was a work ethic. All of the stuff going on about, what do they call it, slow quitting or whatever they call it.
Yeah.
Not my generation. You did not. That was not a thing. It didn't matter if they were being watched or not watched. They did their jobs.
Yeah. So another one of our participants, our female participant, she came back to Seneca Falls with her husband when he was discharged from the Air Force. And so her husband went out to go find a job. He went to the mill and he asked if he could be hired there. And they actually told him, "We don't have a job for you, but if you have a wife, we'll take her." So even going into the 1980s, the mill was really one of the only places where they would consistently hire women. So once the women were working inside the mill, there was this really camaraderie between everyone. They all looked out for each other. There was no backstabbing to get to a higher position or really any animosity between individuals. The women would often get together to celebrate birthdays, weddings, arrival of new little ones. Ellen, I'm talking about her a lot, but she had great stories. She tells a wonderful story about one time she and her mother were going grocery shopping and Ellen saw one of her classmates. And so she was super excited. She went up, started talking to this classmate, and they look over and they're so confused. Their mothers are laughing, smiling, joking like they know each other. Well, it turns out both of their mothers worked at the mill. And that actually was a really common story. It seemed that everybody worked at the mill. So the mill really started kind of enveloping the society of Seneca Falls. Mothers, fathers, children, pretty much everybody went to work at the mill. So once again, Ellen kind of describes this life dynamic, I thought pretty well. She described it as a triangle. So your life revolved around family, church, and the mill. So that was your entire world. And I think
my sense is for all of
I think a lot of this welcoming environment was really due to Bud Sewin, who was he was one of the head men in charge. From the stories I've heard about Bud, he was very warm-hearted, very welcoming individual who knew his workers by name. He knew their children's name, little details about their life. He would go visit them on the floor. And just knowing these little details really led the workers to believe that Bud cared for them. And that creates that loyalty once again. So I have some more audio, and this is once again Ellen. This is a cute little story of Ellen's interaction with Bud.
And so they had this spaghetti dinner supper for the families of all the office workers. So, my mom took me and everybody else was there, and it was a small, crowded area, and it was fun. It was good. Don't ask me how this happened, but Bud Sewin got seated next to me. My mom was here, and I was here, and there was an empty chair, and he came in and looked around and sat himself down. So I'm watching, and he's got his spaghetti. I'd never never seen this before. I don't know who started the conversation, but it was, you know how to do, no, I don't know how to do that. So he taught Bud Sue and taught me how to twirl my spaghetti.
Oh, that was nice.
Wasn't it?
Yeah.
But that says something about the atmosphere. He wasn't here.
Yes.
He
That
sat
was
next to a 7-year-old and taught her how to twirl
Yeah.
spaghetti.
So you have another one of our participants, Gina. She spoke of a story where Bud came up to her, asked her if she had ever been to New York City. Gina said no. So Bud paid for her to go down to New York City. She was able to explore the city. She saw a Broadway show. And they also had a New York City office down there. So she checked out the New York City office, and he never expected anything in return. He just did something nice.
And so they had this.
Whenever I try to go, it restarts the audio. So, all right. Something else that I find unique that the mill did was it brought in a lot of Italian women. The Suin and Gebb families would purchase these Italian knitting machines because they were a lot better quality than pretty much anywhere else. But because of that, they needed people that knew how to work them and repair them. So they would buy these machines and then they would bring over Italian women to work the machines and repair them. They would help them become citizens, and then they would also help them bring over their families. So many of these women would be the seamstresses for the mill, which is kind of where that phrase again, don't mess with the seamstresses, comes from. They were there to work, get the job done. You didn't mess with them. So saying that kind of makes it sound like these women wouldn't be very nice to each other, but the opposite was true. So native Seneca Falls women and the Italian women who came to work at the mill really integrated together. They took care of each other. They shared each other's culture. There was this one Italian woman who shared her tomato sauce recipe with Hazel, who was Ellen's mother. And Ellen actually still uses that same recipe because no other recipe can compare. You know, the Italians, they know their food. So one question that we asked participants was whether there were any benefits. And for this question, we are so glad we ended up having a male participant because turns out that the male and female answers were very different. So for context, our male participant worked in various departments. He was eventually in a supervisory role for about 6 departments, the winding, twisting, turning, inspection, washing, drying, and seamstresses. He was also the go-to man when it came to any questions about the mill, where things were, how to fix a machine, any mill-related questions, he was your man. And he was working for the mill from the late 70s into the 90s. So when I asked about benefits, this is what he had to say. I'm going to put it in a little language warning. It's not bad, but just prepare yourself. Do you receive any benefits like sick time or anything like that?
Oh, hell yeah. I got sick time. I got birthday. We had 8 or 9 holiday pays. Was there so long, you built up vacation time. So he always shut.
So that was what he had to say about it. So as for our female interview participants, they had some other things to say regarding benefits. Ellen said that there were no benefits. If you're sick, you could take a day off, but there was no already established sick time or vacation time. She did tell a story about her mother, Hazel. Hazel needed a surgery that would have taken her out of work for a very long time, many weeks, and not really knowing when she could get back to work. So Hazel made an appointment with Bud Suin at his house, explained the situation to him, told him that she really didn't know when she would be back. And of course, she's doing this because at that time, if you're out of work for lots of time, you're going to be replaced. They need bodies. And so she was worried that she would lose her job. But Bud told her, get the surgery, take the time off, let me know when you're going to be back, and we will have a job for you. Gina, another participant, she worked with both Bud and George. She worked a lot of different roles inside of the mill, but she was a secretary for George for many years. She said that she received life insurance, but that was pretty much it. No sick time, no maternity leave. Our female participant, she said she only received a couple weeks for maternity. And she worked in the inspecting and shipping departments. Michelle, she worked there in the late 80s through to the mid 90s. She told us there was little to no maternity. If you were single, you could have free health insurance, but if you wanted to be on a family plan, you had to buy into it. And her life insurance was $10,000. Our female participant, actually, she receives, I forgot to mention this earlier, she receives a pension now after working there so long, and it's little to nothing. Like, it's almost not even worth it to have it. Finally, Mary tells us probably the best story about the benefits, and her interviews tend to be a little quiet, so just warning you.
Do you receive any like benefits like sick time or anything
Sorry,
like that?
Wrong one. This one.
I went one time to the gynecologist and I handed a card and the receptionist, and she literally laughed. She goes, "This doesn't cover $9 to go." Okay, so yay for Planned Parenthood. That helped me with the cheaper birth control because yeah, it never covered. I know when Stacy had her baby, it covered part of the maternity portion of having the baby, hospital costs, but to go to the doctor, it never, anything for me, it never covered. So I never went to the doctor back then, unless I absolutely had to.
So her health insurance card and her prescription card didn't cover anything. Like you heard, they laughed at her. So Mary also got to a point where she actually tore both of the meniscus in her knees. When she went to the doctors, they told her that the Seneca Knitting Mill wouldn't pay to have them fixed. They would maybe do one, so she kind of had to choose which one hurt the most. So she ended up not doing either. So it's kind of unclear whether these discrepancies in benefits was because of the jobs that they worked, or whether it was male versus female. Just kind of listening to the interviews, it does seem like it was male versus female, but I think we would need to have more interviews to really know for sure. So I'm just going to let you speculate on that one.
Do you receive any like benefits like sick time or anything like that?
There we go. All right. The mill was home to the International Ladies Garment Workers Union. So the union was originally started in 1900 when several unions in New York City combined their resources to create this one cohesive union. Original membership numbered about 2,000 workers. So the union would go on to become affiliate with the American Federation of Labor. And while this union made great strides in collective bargaining, workplace safety, and unionism, they did come under a lot of criticism when it came to representation representation of membership in regards to gender and race. Sorry. The women could be members, but they were really barred from being in any sort of leadership role. Only men could be in the leadership. So the International Ladies Garment Workers Union eventually merged with the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers Union to create the Union of Needle Trades, Industrial and Textile Employees, and that was in 1995. So inside the mill, however, the union was really not well received. Many workers didn't feel like the union sided with them or were on their side regarding pay and benefits. There was a newspaper article that I found from 1945 that stated negotiations between the company and officials of local unions resulted in a contract that, quote, covers wage adjustments, wage increases for both hourly and piece workers, minimum wages, and provides 2 weeks vacation for workers who have been employed by the concern for 5 years or more, and 1 week's vacation for workers who have been employed for upwards of 5 years. End quote. So it kind of seems, judging from the interviews, that contract never really happened or never really made it to most of the mill workers, because we received very different responses from our participants.
Union was terrible. I remember doing a contract, and the union's up there saying, "Oh, you better vote yes, because George is going to shut the plant down." And this was years before he ever sold. And I stood up and I'm like, "Yeah, that is." And as soon as we signed this, we're all going on overtime. We had Kmart, $3 or $4 million contract. And everyone's like, "Oh, no, George will close." I'm like, "But y'all know who my dad is, and I'm telling you." And nobody listened. They voted the contract, and we got like 10-cent raise on our piecework rate, but that was 10 cents over 3 years. So you got 3 cents 1 year and 3 cents the next year. I remember standing there and siding all the time with George. But yeah, they didn't ever side with us. And so
And another one.
George and I, when they had union, there was a union,
Oh, okay.
and it was a ladies' garment union. And when they came to negotiate for their contract, George and I would sit in the meetings. I would take the notes, and I think when they were negotiating for an increase, this is my own impression on it. To them, it seemed like if, say, the union said, "We'll increase your coverage, insurance coverage," but to them, it was more the money angle of it. They didn't, at the time, I don't think they thought how important it was. But now, of course, it's a big thing.
Yeah.
But then your medical issues weren't as expensive as they are now.
It's true.
But yeah, I think their interests gravitated more to the money angle of it.
How much they got right then.
Yeah, and it's understandable.
union was terrible.
George and I, when they
So when the mill closed, it was a huge blow to the community. A couple of our interview participants, they said that they didn't really feel like it changed the community, but everybody else, they felt like something big was taken away from them. Many individuals walked to work, and now they would have to drive out of the village. A lot of them had family and friends that they worked alongside, and now they would have to separate. And actually, a lot of people had skills that really wouldn't benefit them in any other job, because the mill was the last standing textile mill in New York State. So something was taken away from them. The mill had really integrated itself into the fabric of the community, and then to shut down, it really kind of confused and saddened people. Many said that the closing of the surprise came out of nowhere. It was this huge surprise, and they didn't know what to do with themselves after. Our male participant said many workers, including himself, after they got the announcement that the mill would close, they walked down the hill to the bar, they drank away their sorrows, and they never went back. In their eyes, they didn't see the point of going back. They gave so much to the mill, and now they wouldn't get anything in return. Our interviewee, Gina, she was actually the last person to lock up the mill when everybody left. She was the last person to be there. Sorry. Why is this?
It was a blow to the women because a lot of the women didn't drive, and there was 3 or 4 just on Center Street. So I mean, they were right there, and they would walk to the mill. Mary Bella walked from Mechanic Street. Mary Perdico, I think she drove. She came from Shamrock. Lenny came from Shamrock. But a lot of people they didn't drive, and they walked to work every day. And where's she gonna go now? You know,
Where are you gonna go that's that easy to get to?
right. And then a lot of the women when it closed, they were 50s, 60s. So where you going? And they can't do the other work.
So I'm not a native of Seneca Falls. I didn't have any family members that worked in the mill, but in doing these interviews, I've really come to understand kind of what a big deal that this mill was to the community. It's quite revolutionary in that it hired women when nobody else would. They really transformed how textiles were produced, and they survived in an age where technology was kind of starting to really take over. Unfortunately, they weren't able to continue, but once again, Seneca Falls rallied around them with the help of the Seneca Knit Development Corporation and the National Women's Hall of Fame. Now the building is getting a whole second life, and it can tell everyone it's an incredible history. So if you are ever visiting Seneca Falls, I highly encourage you to go visit the National Hall of Fame. The building is fantastic, and even just kind of stepping inside the doors, you can tell that there's just so much history here. If you've ever been inside of a building and you just kind of look around and you're just like, wow, history happened here. That's kind of like what happens when you step inside the mill. On some of the upper floors, which I believe they are going to keep, the Hall of Fame is going to keep this. A lot of the mill workers actually carve their names into the beams. So even the past is kind of making its mark here in modern times. So thank you everyone for listening. If there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them or anything.
Thank you very much, Nellie. That was great. Again, yeah, if there's questions, please put them up in the chat. I'll moderate through those, and that way for this recording. So here's another reminder. It is being recorded, so if you've missed part of this or you want to share it with friends and family, it will be up on our YouTube. So if you search on YouTube for Schoharie Crossing, you'll be able to find it and share it. We'll also put it up on our socials and all that fun stuff. I had a couple of things. Was anybody might want to leave questions or additional comments in the chat. I always kind of like to take notes for these things, and it's I guess it harkens pretty well for myself and probably several of the people that are tuning in that have come from even this area of New York, very post-industrial kind of landscape that we have now. Those in the Amsterdam area that's really close to Schoharie Crossing with the textile mills, the carpet mills there, the Fulton County area known for its glove manufacturing. Some of the inside the mill images that you show, it's really great to demonstrate, how the sausages, how the socks were being made. It really does help. Those are great images. And some of those really do remind me of the things that I've seen inside of the carpet mills or the glove manufacturing, particularly with the, where you have to turn them and put them on the hot press. Let's see, there was a couple other things I had on my notes here. Yeah, the very tactile sense of it. So that's kind of the cool thing those images kind of show. That the concept that it's community, not just income, and that it really winds up being, and I think that I guess I'll voice a level of opinion that also is something very much oriented in a labor force of a physical kind, or in manufacturing, that you develop those kind of, if it's not a dedication to the company, it's also more dedication to your coworkers that you might not get. I think the reference there was that quiet quitting concept, that where people would leave a business or a company. So having that camaraderie and part of a community, the sense of loss when they closed down had to be tremendous.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So seeing if anybody's Mary Beth is asking if you're continuing to reach out for oral histories.
Absolutely. So this kind of, I mean, this helped us create this presentation, but really it's also helping develop our archives. So we will definitely take oral history interviews still, because the information gained from the interviews is going into our archives. So in 20 years, when I might not be around here still, I might be at a different position, someone else can come in and know what happened in the 1920s at the mill. So yes, we will take more history interviews. Once again, our email is on there. You are more than welcome to call us as well. We can get something set up.
There was, I had a quick, you had mentioned early on that it is 1934. It was the second largest. You wouldn't happen to know what the first largest industry would be.
No, unfortunately, I don't. Let me find that.
And in that era, for the 60% of the workforce to be female, it's pretty tremendous.
My assumption, since it's just Seneca, that statistic was really just talking about Seneca Falls. Water pump manufacturing was huge here, so my guess is that's going to be the biggest industry. Because there was, well, by 1934, it was really Gould's Pumps, but I mean, Gould's Pumps is still a household name. So that's my guess.
So anybody have any more questions, please put them in the chat. We've got a few comments here. Glad that they could attend. It's well done. Here's a question. Do you think that if the mill was around today, it would be a similar atmosphere?
It's hard to say. I would say, because a lot of, I think a lot of the loyalty came from who was in charge as well. Because Bud, he was someone that would give you the shirt off of his back. And I think a lot of industry today is about making a buck. So to say that it would have that same, the people would have the same loyalty and love for the company, I think it depends on who's in charge and what the work environment would have become.
I would agree with that. I think, though, that we have bumped into the 1 o'clock hour, and I want to thank you very much. For those that have joined in, I want to thank you very much as well. Share with your friends, family, neighbors, the guy at the bus stop. Let them know that they can tune in for this program and any other programs that Schoharie Crossing has to offer. If you are out in Seneca Falls, make sure you get to the Historical Society, check out their museum space, find them online. And as Nellie had referenced early on, if there are questions that you have, maybe you're laying down this evening and can't get this question out of your head that you thought you should have asked, make sure you reach out on that email address or contact them in some way. Ask her. I'm sure she's beyond anything that we could understand from our point of view here at Schoharie Crossing, a wonderful reference point for Seneca Falls history. And if she doesn't have that information, she knows people that do. So we can lean in on that one. Is there anything upcoming that you might want to give a quick shout out that you have going on?
Well, I will be doing this talk again at the Hall of Fame, I believe in April and July. They are having a couple more events to kick off this rehabilitation efforts inside the building. So that's exciting. But we've got some smaller events happening inside the museum, like a murder mystery dinner that we're super pumped for. Just some fundraising, which you can find all on our Facebook page.
Good. Well, Nellie, thank you so much. I appreciate it. I learned some stuff and I had an enjoyable time along the way.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I had a lot of fun.
Take care, everybody. Be well, be safe.